Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? I hope you sound like you're well. I hope you're being well fed and the fellowship. Welcome to the faculty talk at the Research Institute for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at the Center for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. I'm Prudence Carter. I'm the director of RICSTRI. And on behalf of Jose David Saldivar, who's the director of CCSRE, and Mariam Hamdani, who is the associate director, and myself, I just want to welcome you all to today's talk. We are very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Patricia Guren, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan. I'm going to allow our colleague, Professor Hazel Rose Marcus, who's the Davis Brack Professor in the Behavioral Sciences in the Department of Psychology. Ooh, I'm trying to make you a sociologist. Hazel. In the Department of Psychology here at Stanford, to introduce her, to do a formal introduction. And as many of you know, I often say Hazel needs no introduction on this campus. She is such an integral member of this community. But it was just my task to welcome you, to draw your attention to our series. We do these talks monthly for faculty and graduate students, and we have both faculty on campus as well as colleagues around the country who will come in and talk about various issues that are germane to the study of racial and ethnic and class and gender and all other kinds of social forces in this country. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Hazel to the podium, and she will introduce our guest. And those of you who need seats, there are some along the wall and here on the side here. And yes, please enjoy yourselves. Okay, Hazel.
Prince, I was getting the chairs. I don't know if you said, but this is a co-sponsored event. It's CCSRE and SCOPE. So the Stanford Center on Opportunity Policy and Education. Opportunity Policy Education, right. It's hard so that's welcome everybody, and makes it especially nice to have both units at work together. So I want to say too many things, but first of all, I want to say it's my extreme pleasure and honor to introduce my mentor, colleague, and very close friend of more than 40 years, Pat Guren. Patricia Guren is the Nancy Cantor Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Psychology and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. She's also a faculty associate of the Research Center for Group Dynamics at the Institute for Social Research and the Center for African and Afro-American Studies. It's important to say all of those because that's the kind of person Pat is. She has roles in everywhere. She currently directs the research of the program on intergroup relations, which is a curricular program that's sponsored by the College of Literature, Science, and Arts and a division of Student Affairs at University of Michigan. She is, by training, a social psychologist. Her work has focused on social identity, the role of social identity in political attitudes and behavior, motivation and cognition in various achievement settings, and the role of social structure in intergroup relations. She's the author of 8 books and monographs and many, many articles on all of these topics. She, very importantly, was an expert witness for the University of Michigan's defense of its undergraduate and law school admissions policies. Many of you may know her, particularly for that. In collaboration with many colleagues, she provided the critical expert report on the educational value of diversity for these lawsuits. And if you go looking, you will come up with the Guren report. So those are the things that, I want to say to locate her in social space. But there's so many more things I could say. I could start by telling you about Pat's history with SNCC and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and how she was in Atlanta in 1963, and then went to Washington and had to negotiate those very difficult issues in those days. She recently wrote a beautiful remembrance of that March on Washington, and I think we're allowed to share that, are we, Pat? Because it sets the time and the context, which was just amazing. So I could tell you about Pat as a warrior for racial equality from the earliest days. She is I would say the foremost expert on diversity, on multiculturalism, on pluralism in the United States, in the world. She knows that to work, diversity has to be in our minds, and the importance of diversity has to be there in our minds, but very importantly, it has to be baked into the everyday interpersonal interactions of our lives. It has to be baked into the practices, the policies, and products of our institutions before we're going to get diversity that's successful. So I was lucky enough for the 24 years in which I overlapped with Pat at the University of Michigan to see Pat, to watch her doing diversity. And as I don't have to tell the people in this room, doing diversity is a full-time job. Pat was trained as a social psychologist in the combined program, which was sociology and psychology together, making a social psychology program. And there were a few famous programs, one at the University of Michigan and one at Harvard. Those are two famous ones. These wonderful programs that put both of these disciplines together into social psychology fell apart because, as always, there were fights over the canon and arguments over, what the graduate students had to read to be a true social psychologist. But I think this training led her to the view that the mind, the self, the psyche, the identity, whatever you want to call it, the person, is shaped by the sociocultural historical context it inhabits. So the point is, the mind does not float free. Pat always knows, and she pounded into our heads, that ideas, values, beliefs, goals, schemas, mindsets, construals, all these things that we study as psychologists that are so critical in how we understand the world, these entities and processes have to be supported and scaffolded by the practices and policies of our institutions, or they can only be so effective. So valuing diversity is good. Having the right ideas about diversity is good. It's an okay place to start, but unless the institution supports diversity in everything it does, the impact will necessarily be limited. So from my view, this is, I think, one of the most important messages of Pat's life work. Just a few little examples I'll give you. I remember as a graduate student, in social psychology, we wanted to have a committee to raise some funds. We thought that students could go abroad and visit other social psychology centers. So I made a committee, and it seemed to me that I would make a committee that would be effective. So I got 4 women in social psychology together, and this was going to be the committee. And so we took it to Pat to ask her advice, and she said, "That's not a committee." I said, "Well, what do you mean it's not a committee? It's a committee, it's like 4 people, we know each other, we've worked together, it'll be a good committee, we'll be able to do this." And she said, "It's not a committee. There's no men, there's no people of color, and everyone on the committee is a social psychologist. Where's the diversity? You can't have a committee unless there's diversity. What's the point of having a committee?" And it was like a thunderbolt, because it was, sort of obvious, but I was thinking, well, we could work quickly and effectively. We all share the same ideas. And she was always one that, no, you have to have competing perspectives. And I said, well, yeah, but we'll fight. And she said, good. Conflict is good. That's good, And of course, the research now shows, for example, in jury studies, that if you have mixed race juries, they deliberate longer, they use more facts, and they make better decisions in the sense that they take more evidence into account. So the research now backs her up on how diversity makes you a smarter and better decision maker. But I just wanted to share with you one early experience. Pat also knew that it was one thing to diversify the student body, but if you didn't have diversity among the faculty, what kind of message did that send? So she worked every day of her life, on the time I knew, since 1970, to try to diversify the graduate students, and to diversify the graduate student body, and to diversify the faculty. And she knew long before Sheryl Sandberg told us that it was important to lean in. Pat knew that if you were a person of color, a woman, an underrepresented minority of anyone, you had to lean in. You had to lean in and get some power so you could actually do something at the institutional level, so things would be different. So she took every opportunity she could to take one of those positions to make things different. just most significantly when she was chair of the psychology department. Psychology department at the University of Michigan is a huge department, but when she took the reins, there were 5 faculty of color, and when she left, there were 35, and many of those are still in place at the University of Michigan. And she did it in very creative ways that we could talk about later. So, and then finally, what she's doing now, she also knows that with the student body, it's not enough to make the student body diverse. She's worked to do that. That's a start. It's also very important to do what many people on our campus are doing, important work on letting students know that they belong, that there are other students like them at the university, that if they stick with it, things will get better, things that really make a difference, helping students understand how to construe their experiences differently. But she knows that key to making all of that work is a set of institutional changes to policies and practices that will really get students, once they're together in the same place, interacting with each other and coming to understand each other across divides of race, ethnicity, gender, class, and religion. And that's what she's going to talk about today, how you do this so you make use of a diverse student body. And it's very beautifully described in the book, Dialogues Across Diversity. I know she won't say this, so I'm going to tell you that. There are some up here on the table that you can buy by writing a check, and there's an order form too. So after you hear her, please come up and do that. Okay, that's enough, Pat. I could go on and on, but thank you so much for being here.
So what Hazel didn't say, quite as dramatically as I will say, is that Hazel, I was faculty member when Hazel was a graduate student, but I have learned more from Hazel over the years than almost anybody I know. So isn't it wonderful that a so-called mentor just keeps on learning from the person that was much younger? We're also incredibly close family friends. It matters enormously to me. A year ago, my husband and I had an 80th and 90th birthday. And it wouldn't have been possible to really have that happen without Hazel there. Okay, so I'm really delighted to be here and share a book that I care about. I'm not trying to make money on a book, I just want people to read it. So it is indeed about engaging diversity, because it's not enough. You have an extraordinarily diverse student population here. So the question gets to be, and you have students who live together for 4 years. That is absolutely the greatest potential in the world for engaging diversity. So the question gets to be, how much is it engaged? And in what ways is it engaged? So that's what I want to do today, is talk about why that has to be a strategic mission of higher education in the 21st century. So let me set the context, however. First, I want to talk just a little bit about why engaging diversity, especially when it involves talking about race, but other social divides as well, why that's so incredibly difficult. And then I want to make a case for the educational importance of doing this, and it's a case based in 3 major challenges facing the United States and other countries as well. I want to talk about intergroup dialogue as one educational approach, but only one, it's not a panacea, as a way to address those challenges. And finally, a few words about 21st century education as cosmopolitan and outward. So we know that talking about race, across race especially, or talking about any social divide, could be class, could be sexual orientation, could be domestic international, could be religion, religion's a big one. Across those groups is really incredibly difficult. And there's a lot of social psychology work that's been done, especially on race, mostly in the intergroup contact area or intergroup relations area of social psych, that interactions involving race and ethnicity are plagued with a number of problems. For whites, concerns about appearing to be prejudiced, anxiety, depleted executive functioning, increased cardiovascular reactivity, and nervous behaviors. In what you might say, whites are pretty vulnerable people. And for racial ethnic minorities, concerns about being the target of prejudice, that there's a tendency to invoke compensatory strategies in these interactions, and so one often feels inauthentic, and that there's a lot of negative emotions. So there's a whole lot of experimental studies that show these kinds of things can happen when there's interracial interaction occurring. And then there's this wonderful book that Hazel and Paula did that is about doing race, and their first chapter, I think, is absolutely the best thing out about why it's so difficult to talk about race. And they say that even though race and ethnicity pervade every aspect of our lives, many of us become deeply uncomfortable whenever the conversation turns to race. And they detail 8 conversation stoppers, which most of you know about since they're here, and Paula's back there. And among them are things like, we're beyond race, or everyone's a little bit racist, or that's just identity politics, which means we don't have to talk about it, right? And yet, people call for a conversation across race, inevitably when some crisis occurs.
Yeah, there have been talk about, should we convene a conversation on race? I haven't seen that be particularly productive when politicians try to organize conversations. They end up being stilted and politicized, and folks are locked into the positions they already have. On the other hand, in families and churches and workplaces, there's the possibility that people are a little bit more honest, and at least you ask yourself your own questions about, am I wringing as much bias out of myself as I can? Am I judging people as much as I can based on not the color of their skin, but the content of their character?
The president did is open the door. Yep. To begin a conversation. What he did, I think, is start the process and sort of sanction, if you will, the need for there to be a discussion and action steps. This conversation at the grassroots level, at the community level, within boardrooms and suites also, has just begun. And I think what I hope it leads to, and what I hope we will see, is not only a discussion that started and ends quickly, but a discussion that will lead to serious action steps by the nation.
Well, we know it wasn't sustained and it didn't lead to anything. And we'll have another call for a conversation about race for some other crisis, whether it's something like the Trayvon Martin case or it's something else. So we don't sustain these conversations, we don't go very deep, we avoid them, and we don't know how to have them. So what I want to do is to talk today about why it's crucial in 21st century education for our students to gain the skills that they're going to need, not just to talk about race and other social divides, but to be the kinds of leaders domestically and globally that they really have to be. And there are some real skills that are involved in being those kinds of leaders. Recently, I heard Yo-Yo Ma with the Silk Road Ensemble in a Charlie Rose episode, in which he was arguing essentially why diversity is crucial in the Silk Road Ensemble. And he talked about the diversity of the musicians resulting in greater imagination, greater flexibility, empathy, and collaboration. And he argued from those 4 things, you get innovation, you get new music. And then there were 3 musicians who were there who talked about how that worked for them, how learning about somebody else's musical tradition, not their own, added to their own musical tradition, had in their musical lives produced innovation, that is, new music. And that's what I think 21st century education has to do. And diversity is absolutely crucial for its realization. So let me put this all in the context of what I think are 3 major challenges facing the United States. The demographic challenge, and since you live in California, you know all about the demographic challenge, but many people in our country don't know about it. A democratic challenge, which is really about inequality, the extraordinary increase in inequality in our country, and where we stand internationally with respect to inequality. And what I call the dispersion challenge, which is really Fareed Zakaria's Rise of the Rest. So I'll take up each of these for a minute or so. So the demographic challenge. You all know the facts that sometime in the 2020s, 2040s, 2042, 2043, we will be a minority-majority country, or majority-minority country, whichever way you want to put it. And that'll happen among young people sometime around 2023. And it's inevitable, because here's the babies born in 2011. So there are 2.5 times as many non-white babies as white babies born in 2011, and they're going to grow up, and they will be us. And so this is who we will be. So this is an inevitable, intractable, this is happening. And this is why the demographic challenge is a huge one in the United States, that people, some are fearful, some are embracing. I only wish I could live long enough to see it all. Some people embrace, some people are fearful, but it's going to happen. And of course, it had huge implications in the 2012 election. So here's the percent of 4 groups who voted for Obama and Romney. 71% of Latinos, Latinas, 73% of Asian Americans, 93% of African Americans voted for Obama, 39% of whites. And believe me, that's exactly why there is some conversation now happening about immigration reform. It was not in either campaign. There wasn't a word spoken about immigration reform in the 2012 campaign. This is what's producing that conversation. Now, it waxes and wanes. It's on the table, it's off the table, it appears to be off the table at the moment. But we wouldn't be having any conversation at all about immigration reform but for this picture of what's happening politically. But of course, it's not just in politics, it's in every aspect of our lives that this is happening. And certainly for higher education, here's some 2050 projections of what higher education may look like. Now, 2050 is a long way off, and maybe it won't look just like this, but it's suggestive at least. It shows that over half of students in community colleges will be Latinos, Latinas. A quarter will be white, 10% Asian American, and 8% African American. And nearly half in public four-year institutions will be Latinos, Latinas. A third white, 15% Asian background, and 8% African Americans. So is there discourse about what's happening? Not at my institution. It's as though we're still going to teach the same kinds of students that we're teaching now, and nothing will change. But everything is going to change. Let me turn to the democratic challenge. Again, you know the facts, that the top 1% has now, in the past 3 decades, starting in the 1980s, had a huge proportion of the increased wealth in this country. And here's the top 10% of the households in this country now having 80% of all financial wealth. And the bottom 80% have 7% of the wealth. This is a Domhoff piece that in the slide is one I really got from Hazel. See how wonderful it is to have. But the most important thing I think that we don't often know is where we stand in the world. We are 101st in terms of the amount of inequality that we have. There are 100 other countries who have less inequality than we do. 9 European countries have less inequality than the United States. So does Canada. So do India, China, and Iran. And what you don't know from this slide is who some of our peers are. And our peers are Cameroon, Mexico, Ivory Coast, and I don't have the list right in front of me, but there's about 7 or 8 that are our peers with respect to how much inequality we have. We also have a great myth of exceptional social mobility in this country. We all grew up, I suspect, believing that we're the most egalitarian society in the world, that people can rise, and that there's this, you'll have more income, you'll have a better house, you'll have more access for education for your children than your parents did. That this is sort of like what we believe about the United States. But in fact, it's harder for Americans to rise from lower economic rungs than people in Canada, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Germany, France, and what I love, even Great Britain, that we think of as a very class-ridden society. But in fact, they have more social mobility than we do. Well, it's a threat to democracy when you have this kind of inequality. this all started really in the 1980s. So we've had 3 decades of growth in inequality. We had that period between 1930 and the end of 1970 when really there was much less inequality than there had been previously and that there is now. But it's a special threat to democracy when inequality is disproportionately located in certain groups, and of course we know it is. So here's a picture of the median net worth of white households in 2007, which is 18 times that of Latino households, 20 times that of African American households. And between 2005 and 2009, the median net worth went down for everybody. It was the recession. We know it went down for everybody, but only 16% for white households and 66% for Latino households and 53% for African American households. So we have a very disproportionate impact of what's happening economically in this country, with certain groups experiencing much more inequality than others. So we don't do well internationally, and we don't do well internally, domestically, and inequality in general has risen so incredibly in the past 3 decades. That's a democratic threat. And in fact, all students need to know about this, not just sociology students, students in nursing, students in the business school, engineers, because what's going to happen to deal with inequality in this country is a crucial way that they, as leaders in the future, are going to have to figure out what to do about public policy. This is a crucial aspect of engaging diversity. Diversity is not kumbaya and we all stand in love. It's about really addressing tough stuff, like what are we going to do about inequality? The dispersion challenge has to do with the rise of other countries. George W. Bush suggested that we could go it alone. Well, we can't go it alone. So there's the BRICS, but it's not just the BRICS, it's many other countries as well. And yes, the BRICS have had some loss in economic loss in the past few years, but they're still doing very well. So Zakaria says in this wonderful book of his called Post-American World, at the political military level, we will remain in a single superworld world. We'll be, in fact, he doesn't say this, but we'll be the policeman for the world. But in every other dimension, industrial, financial, educational, social, and cultural, the distribution of power is shifting away from American dominance. Now, this kind of statement is what's driving conservatives crazy, but in fact, it's true, and therefore, what do our students need in order to be effective in the world and engaging with people from these other countries, many of whom have what Hazel talks about as a different kind of cultural press, which has much more to do with interdependence and relationships and much less than we do about those issues. So are we ready? Well, what do they need? They need broad knowledge across many disciplines. They need communication, problem solving, and collaboration skills, which is really where intergroup dialogue comes into it. These are skills all students need, whatever their discipline. They need critical, creative, adaptive, and flexible thinking, which is what Yo-Yo Ma was stressing about the impact of diversity in the Silk Road Ensemble. So we have to engage diversity if our students are going to be able to do what they're going to need to do to deal with the rise of the rest and be effective in the world. So let me talk about intergroup dialogue and how we approach addressing these challenges, all three, the demographic, the democratic, and the dispersion challenges. It's just one approach to 21st century education. Its goals are threefold. First, intergroup understanding, and that's largely understanding about group-based inequalities. This is a crucial part of intergroup dialogue. Secondly, increasing the positive intergroup relationships, mostly intergroup empathy and motivation to bridge differences. And thirdly, intergroup collaboration and alliance building. Now, let's be clear that this is just one approach. There's also wisdom in students having comfort zones, being in their own communities, having identity-based interactions with people who are like them. This isn't saying you get rid of any of that. It's saying it's both and, that students also need this intergroup experience in order to gain these kinds of skills. And we do it engaging diversity through a distinct pedagogy and through very distinctive communication processes that take place in these classes. So what is an intergroup dialogue? It's two social identity groups. It could be Arabs and Jews, which we have at Michigan. It could be a dialogue that is. It could be African Americans and whites. It could be Latinos and Asian Americans. It could be Christians and Muslims. It could be affluent and a little less affluent. We have about the same picture of affluence that you do here at Stanford. So it's hard to say it's really across class. So there's two identity groups in this room. The students get there by applying to be in an intergroup dialogue course. They can't just enroll. It's sort of like fraternity and sorority rush. We offer 10 to 12 intergroup dialogue courses a term at Michigan, and students rank order which ones they want, and then we try to give them their first or second choice. There are two facilitators, one from each of these identity groups. They could be student-trained facilitators, they could be professional staff, trained facilitators, they could be faculty, and that differs a little bit across institutions. It's a 10 to 12 week course in most places. It's credit bearing. It's graded. And it follows a 4-module curriculum that's pretty standardized. It has to deal with asymmetries in power. And all this is cast in power terms. For those of you who heard Hazel's talk yesterday, this is very much about independence and interdependence as well. So when the people who come from high power groups tend to want to focus on individuals. They want personal sharing. They want to get to know each other. They want to focus on commonalities, and goodness knows there are lots of commonalities across differences as well. And they really want individual action. It's an independence theme that's there very much in what students from high power groups want, at least in the United States. And students from lower power groups are more apt to really say, hey, you know what, there are groups. I had a teaching experience some years back with a first-year seminar. I was doing role-playing, asking the students to do role-playing. I didn't think they were getting much about the experience of each other. So I gave half of the students, 10, ethnic and racial roles that were not their own, and the other 10 students observed. And a young white student in the middle of this screamed and said, I just hate being treated like this. I'm not just white. You don't know what I think about because I'm white. You don't know anything about me. And I just sat there. And pretty soon, an African-American male student from Westport, Connecticut, went over to her and picked up her hand and said, yeah, I know. Me too, I just want to be an individual. But you know what? I can't be, because at night, when I walk across this campus, people walk away from me. So he says, as he looks at her and the rest of the class, we're both individuals, but we're also part of groups. And that's going to happen indelibly. Now, that's a learning that I couldn't possibly have taught from a lecture. And so people from low power groups want that kind of learning to happen, that groups really matter. Yes, we're individuals, but groups really matter. So storytelling is important for both sets of students, but storytelling on the high power group is about, we're going to illuminate how much commonality we have. And storytelling when it's from students from lower power groups is very much about how we're different, and what our different experiences have been. And they very much want action. A real critique of some ways of doing dialogue is it's just talk and it's not action, and these students really want action. So I think this, though cast in power terms, is very much the kind of thing that Hazel was talking about yesterday as well. So there's a 4-module curriculum. First, they have to learn how to dialogue. They don't know how. They know how to do what I call serial monologue. That's what happens in all of our classes, the best of our classes. So students in a small discussion class are sitting there in a circle, and the first student is waiting for the second student to shut up so that the first student can talk. And it just goes that way. It's like a serial monologue. And rarely do the students ask each other questions. Rarely do they follow up on each other's stories or comments or points of view. So it's really a bunch of serial monologues, and we faculty do it as well. We talk, we don't ask questions as much as we should. So they have to learn how to do it, and how do they learn? They learn with listening exercises, they learn with asking question exercises, they learn how to dialogue for 3 weeks. Then they learn a lot about identity and power. They learn about identities don't just float out there. They're embedded in social structure. So I'm not just an affluent white woman. That is a position in this society. It's not my unique characteristics. It is who I am and where I'm embedded. They have to learn that. They have to learn that identities are not just things that belong to them personally, but they exist out there in the world. And then they have a 3-week thing where they dialogue about hot topics that they themselves choose. And the question is, can they dialogue, or do they still just debate? Do they just argue? Do they not listen to each other? Do they not ask questions? When the going gets tough, when it's about stuff that is really hot for them. And finally, the last 3 weeks of the class, they have to do some kind of intergroup collaboration, and they have to present it back to to their fellow students. Now, this is not a big, elaborate project because it's a 3-week thing. And what we're trying to do here is not so much what did they learn about inequality on the campus, because always it's based on inequality. It's not the learning of the thing out there as much as it is what were their dynamics like in their group. How did they come to terms with what project to do? How do they divide up the labor? How do they work with each other? Who was social loafing? How do they handle social loafing? So it's that kind of stuff that should happen in that last part of dialogue. There's a distinctive set of things, but there's also some things in common with every course. There's a syllabus, there's readings, there's written assignments. But the thing that really is distinctive is every class session is full of active learning exercises. There is no lecturing. There is absolutely zero point of view that comes from the facilitators as a lecture that comes that day. And then it's always facilitated. And I want to give you just an example of one kind of exercise to give you some sense of a flair of how this works. This is called the web of oppression, and I think it's a wonderful way to teach social structure. So these students are all holding onto a web. You can just see a portion of the students. They're asked to be quiet during this exercise. And then you see little index cards there. And if this were a gender dialogue, this might have to do with how one card might have to do with the media and gender. One might have to do with the health disparities. So each of them have to do with some institutional source of inequality for that topic. And they read those cards. And again, they're quiet. And then we ask the student, one by one, to drop their piece of the web. And guess what? Until the whole thing is everybody's dropped it, inequality's not gone. So we're trying to teach, the sources of inequality come from institutions, and they're interdependent, they don't exist alone, and to change, one has to deal with all of them. Now, I've taken lots of social classes, and I'm sure you have too, many of you, and talking about inequality in social classes is very, very abstract. It's hard to get it because students don't see institutions. They see people. But this helps them really get how inequality functions in its institutional source. So it's just an example of a structured interaction that happens in intergroup dialogue. Well, what makes it work? First of all, facilitation, facilitation, facilitation. This is not students getting together and shooting the bull. This is not unfacilitated student conversations. And there are distinctive processes. Two that we call one, dialogic processes. Students have to learn to actively listen. They have to learn to ask questions, do follow-up and inquiry, and they share. Now, they know how to share, but they really don't know how to do the first two. And then what we call critical processes. This is critical thinking. In addition to listening to each other, they have to learn to identify the assumptions that lie behind what they hear. So it's like listening with a third ear for what is going on, what's behind what a fellow student is saying. They have to learn to do critical analysis of inequalities, and at the end of every class, they have to do either personal or collective reflection, and my preference is for collective reflection. That is to say, what did we learn here today? I can't tell you how many times in my classes before I learned to do this work, I never asked students what they learned. I assumed they learned what I taught. But it's really crucial to have a collective conversation. What did we learn here today? And that's a crucial part of intergroup dialogue. Well, does it work? Does intergroup dialogue work? First, there's the issue of evidence of effects, and then if it does work, how does it work? So that's what the multiversity research project that's covered in the book is all about, and here's the 9 universities that were part of it. Why these 9 universities? Because emissaries from Michigan had gone off and started intergroup dialogue programs elsewhere. Only Arizona State had developed their own dialogue program without any influence of Michigan whatsoever. So these are former grad students, former faculty, former staff who went to these universities. And this project was not to create intergroup dialogue programs, it was to do the research on them, so they had to exist. So here's the design. Because students don't enroll in intergroup dialogue, they have to apply. At these 9 universities, it was possible to take the applicants to a race dialogue and to a gender dialogue, and either randomly assign them to the dialogue course or to a waitlist control group. Now, why is that so important? Up to this point, at least when I was doing that work for the affirmative action case, the best of the studies available at that time were sort of pre-post tests. Students get measured and then they have some experience. They go abroad, then they get measured at the end. But we don't know from those pre-post tests whether students would have changed in exactly that same way, even if they hadn't had that specific experience, but they just lived for 3 more months, or they had 3 more months of college. So we need something that has the possibility of saying we can attribute what happened here to this course because we randomly assigned identical students either to get it or not to get it. So that's a crucial part of this study. Both groups get a pretest at the beginning of the semester. Then there's the intervention or the experimental manipulation, which is the intergroup dialogue course. Then they get a measurement at the end of the semester, and then we do a follow-up a year later. So from beginning to end, it's 16 months. And here's who they were. We ran altogether 52 dialogue experiments, which included 26 race courses with 26 control groups, and 26 gender courses with 26 control groups across these 9 universities. Altogether, 726 students in the dialogue groups and 721 in the waitlist control group. We wanted to have an equal proportion of white men and women and women and men of color. And as you can see from the pie chart, we essentially accomplished that. Now, we are not idiots. We know that all students of color are not alike. But even at our program, which is the largest in the country, there are not enough students of color either on the campus or applying for intergroup dialogue courses to pair up, for example, African American students and Arab students, or white students and Latino students. They're just not there. So this is a real limitation of this study. They were not able to look at how this works for different groups of color rather than groups of color together. We also did a qualitative study. We did videotaping in an early, mid, and late session of 10 race dialogues and 10 gender dialogues, just to see what's going on there. And then we interviewed all the students in those 20 dialogue courses, 248 students at the end of the term. And the thing I love most is because this is the same dialogue curriculum everywhere at these 9 universities. the same readings, the same assignments, the same final paper assignment. It was possible to take the final papers of 720 people and do a content analysis of what they say they learned from these courses. All right, here's what we got. I'm just giving you 3 examples. Here's a picture of intergroup empathy. As expected, given randomization, they start out the same. Then the dialogue group increases, that's the green line. The control group, remember, they're just like the dialogue students, they just didn't get the course. They don't increase at all. And a year later, there's some fading of the dialogue students. We faculty have to remember that what we teach, they don't always remember. There is some fading in everything we teach. But that difference a year later is still statistically reliable. Now you can see these are not big effects here. And in fact, they aren't. The effect size across all of our measures is about 0.2 to 0.5, but they're very, very consistent, and you'll see that in a moment. And here's a student talking about intergroup empathy.
I had to learn to listen carefully to my classmates so that I could better understand their perspectives and experience empathy. At times this was challenging, but it helped me to open my mind and to understand other people from different identities.
And here's very much the same picture on understanding structural causes of inequality. This is a measure that's a composite of understanding the structural or institutional sources of both race and gender inequality. And it's very much the same. They start out the same. There's an increase for the dialogue students. Here there's really not much fading, and that difference a year later is still reliable. And here's a student talking about that.
The different privileges and discriminations that the other classmates were facing, dealing with gender, ethnic identity, religion, and many others. I learned a lot from the readings, but I learned most from the experiences of everyone else around me.
And here's a picture of intergroup collaboration. Here it's a little different. Again, there's a significant increase over the course of the term for the dialogue students, the green line. And there is some increase in both groups over the next 12 months or 16 months later. But again, there's still a difference a year later between those two groups of students. And here's another
So
student.
I learned that forming alliances means getting out of your comfort zone. Alliances arise out of our differences, but also from the similarities we share. We had a common goal that was basically to shed light on the issue of race and ethnicity within our society.
So an overall picture, we had 24 measures of psychological processes that are both cognitive and affective, and these intergroup understanding, relationship, and action measures. And of those, there's a significant impact of dialogue on 20 of those 24. And moreover, it happened in both race and gender dialogues. And it happened for all 4 groups of students. Now, there is a mystique that really these kinds of things are good for white students, but surely students of color don't get anything out of this at all. And it is true that the effects were a little larger for white students than for students of color, but on almost all of these measures, there was a significant impact of dialogue for students of color as well. So everybody's benefiting. It isn't just the students who are the least knowledgeable when they come into, and they truly do differ. White students and students of color differ enormously when they first come into dialogue, but they still increase both groups from where they start. And moreover, these effects were still evident a year later on 21 of these 24 measures. So it's the consistency across time, across measures, across groups that's really impressive about these effects. I'm not going to go over these effects. I just want to show you a little bit about how we think it works, and it does. So we're in charge of setting up the pedagogical features, the content, the written assignments, the facilitation. And that should increase those distinctive dialogic and critical communication processes, and it does. And both really ought to increase the cognitive involvement of students and the affective involvement of students in the class, and it does. And then it's what happens to individuals. What's this learning, this cognitive emotional learning going on that ought to really produce those outcomes, and they do. So our expectation was a kind of indirect model, that what we set up goes through what happens internally to students, and that they then are producing the outcomes. But look at that blue line. That blue line is those communication processes that happen during the class. And yes, it does set up greater cognitive involvement. Yes, they do set up greater emotional engagement. But also they have direct effects on all the outcomes. And moreover, a year later, they still do. So what happened a year ago in terms of those kinds of distinctive communication processes that are taking place are having an impact on where students end up on those outcomes a year later. Well, I want to quickly go back to those challenges. So we want a cosmopolitan education. And I'm going to draw from Anthony Appiah, I'm not sure whether I pronounce it Appiah or Appiah, who's a professor of philosophy at Princeton and very well known, and Martha Nussbaum at Chicago, also philosophy. They write a little differently, but they both talk about 21st century education or cosmopolitan education comprised of these four things. So Appiah says about pluralistic perspective that there are many values worth living by. And we should expect people from different societies and different backgrounds in our own will embody different ideas and values, but within an overall common humanity. Both talk about critical thinking. Nussbaum says, and I love this quote, students have to step away from the comfort of assured truths, from the nestling feeling of being surrounded by people who share one's convictions and passions, so that what they've taken to be natural and normal turns out to be merely parochial and habitual. They both talk about empathy. Nussbaum calls it narrative imagination. It is true we never completely get another person, but we can imagine what their lives are like. And so it's an increase in imaginative empathy that we're talking about. And they also both talk about integrating these specific group-based identities with some broader superordinate identity as well. The spirit, I think, of multiculturalism, social justice, diversity education is really not to simply have students live by their specific group identities, but to see both commonalities and differences. And Nussbaum says, students may continue to regard themselves with their special loves. It may be their families, it may be their religions, it may be their ethnic or racial communities, or even their countries, although I think it's really unlikely that any United States student is talking about being American. But they must also and centrally learn to recognize humanity in all of its strange guises. So how do we do this? Not just with intergroup dialogue. I'm not out here to say everybody should start intergroup dialogue programs, but a deliberate use of diversity to foster communication, problem solving, and collaboration skills in every arena possible. A pedagogy that creates active learning, not just lecturing. It's not that we shouldn't have lecture classes, but every student should have classes that are not that as well, with a focus on those communication processes where students will learn the kinds of skills that they need. And what I think is crucial is collective and private reflection, a chance to both write about what you've learned and collectively discuss what you're learning as a crucial part of this. And finally, connecting all that to substantive disciplinary knowledge. So how do we do some of this at Michigan? I'm just going to very briefly talk about a few of these things, mention them really. Groups and teams. So we're doing a lot with STEM in the engineering school. You know, engineers, more than any other discipline, say groups and teams are important. It's part of their accreditation process. You can't get through engineering without learning something about groups and teams. So they have to learn how to do that. And increasingly they have to learn how to deal with people in their group who are not from their own background, so they know how they can negotiate, collaborate, and dialogue across all these bricks and people all over the world and all over this country. Community-based dialogues. We're doing now in the 9th year dialogues in Detroit. Detroit is one of the most segregated cities in the country. These are done by neighborhoods. So we pair up Grosse Pointe, which is largely white, with the only Latino barrio we have, which is now very multiracial actually, called Southwest Detroit. Or we pair up Bloomfield Hills with Dearborn, which is the largest Arab community outside of the Middle East. So community-based organizations in those communities get students, and the community-based organizations take responsibility for carting the students back and forth across these neighborhoods. Happens in the summer. It's a 6-week program. The first 2 weeks are intra-group dialogues in their own community, and then 4 weeks of inter-neighborhood or inter-community dialogues. And they end up at Michigan for 4 days, trying to create for themselves, high school students, an action project for the following year, either for their high school alone or for high schools in the two communities. It's a terrific K-12 or high school program. We're now running faculty workshops. I've done 3 at Michigan, and there are 16 faculty who spend 4 days and sometime in May, and they're not going to start intergroup dialogue. They want to learn how to use some of these approaches in their own classes. How do they do dialogic stuff? And one of the things that's very clear is that they, I said it last night at dinner, they're very loath, even though they look different. There are all kinds of people who come to this workshop. They're very reluctant to ever divulge anything about their own identities to the students. But the students are incredibly curious, of course, about who these people are. So one of the things that we learn how to do in that workshop is how to actually tell students something about ourselves. And they go through a lot of the exercises that we use in intergroup dialogue, and then the last afternoon, they're put into groups of 4, and they know they have to teach some module that they've had in their class, and that afternoon they're going to teach it somewhat differently given that they've done this workshop. And the other 3 of us who are in their teaching module are playing we're students. And so all 4 of them are teaching something they've always taught, but now they're going to use something a little different in the way they teach. It's a powerful experience, highly positively evaluated, and the only thing that keeps us from doing a lot more is just having enough budget to do it. It's important to have academic and student affairs collaborations, which we talked about this morning, and which you have a great possibility of doing here. Dialogue training needs to be there for students who are doing community-based work. We have, I'm sure you do too, lots of students out doing community-based research, community-based service, and they're going to communities often that they didn't grow up in. They don't know anything about those communities. And so how do they connect with, how do they dialogue with people in those communities? And then lots and lots of international collaborations. And then we have been running at Michigan now, National Institutes and Lacana and Aaron, and I don't know who all else, all came to one of those institutes. We now have people from this over 150 institutions who come in the summer. They are not going back usually to start intergroup dialogue programs. They're going back to learn how to use some of intergroup in order to make all this happen. So it's all engaging diversity in very, very explicit ways. Here's acknowledgments to the foundations. And here are all my collaborators. Nothing about this is done alone. Co-investigators and collaborators at each of the 9 institutions. And that's it.